So I am delighted that you were able to join us for today's Mineta Transportation Institute Research Snaps webinar. My name is Dr. Hillary Nixon, and I serve as the Deputy Executive Director for MTI. MTI is a U.S. Department of Transportation funded University Transportation Center at San Jose State University. Our mission is to increase mobility for all by improving the safety, efficiency, accessibility, and convenience of our nation's transportation system. Approaches for evaluating the quality of bicycling have become increasingly important for planning bicycle infrastructure improvements. LTS, or level of traffic stress, is a framework that looks at different infrastructure characteristics to classify the biking experience. This research we will be presenting today compares various LTS methods with a ride reporting app to assess the relationship between LTS and rider satisfaction. The authors also present a number of policy and practice recommendations to maximize the bicyclist experience. During today's webinar, I would like to ask that you keep your audio muted to avoid any background noise that may impact the sound quality for all participants. If you have questions, please submit those questions through the conference systems chat feature. You will most likely find this button located along the black bar framing your Zoom window, either at the bottom or along the side. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speakers: Chester Harvey, Dr. Kevin Fang, and Dr. Dan Rodriguez. Chester Harvey is a PhD candidate in city and regional planning at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Kevin Fang is an assistant professor of geography, environment, and planning at Sonoma State University. And Dr. Daniel Rodriguez is Chancellor's Professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning and Associate Director of the Institute for Transportation Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you all, and I will turn our presentation over to Chester to get us started. Thank you, Chester.
Okay, thank you, Hillary. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chester Harvey. As Hillary mentioned, I'm going to be leading the presentation to start off with today, and then Kevin and Daniel will join me in answering questions for the rest of the session. So as Hillary noted, our presentation today is about research that we are just finishing up, looking at different LTS systems and then also comparing LTS systems to a crowdsourced method for measuring bicycle satisfaction. Essentially, this is a way of validating the role of LTS and expressing what makes good bicycle infrastructure. The presentation today is going to be a fairly high overview of a much longer report that is available from the MTI website. And so these slides will be available to you, including this link to go look at the report if you're interested in more nitty-gritty details, or I'm happy to answer questions at the end of the presentation about those. So just to start off with very briefly, I'm assuming that most of our viewers have some familiarity with the LTS system. But to summarize, it's generally expressed as a 4-level system that starts with the lowest level of facilities that are designed to be appropriate for really all types of cyclists. So these include children, folks who are just starting to bicycle, and then at the opposite extreme, at LTS 4, really only appropriate for the most confident cyclists. And those would be streets with, for example, without bike lanes, with high speeds, etc. One of the things that has emerged in the sort of LTS landscape is that there are a lot of different ways of trying to calculate these different levels. So one of the most familiar is the system that was developed actually by Hillary as a co-author with Mercuria and Firth in 2012, also through an MTI research study. So that's often, I think, described as sort of the almost original, although not quite original. There were some previous studies that looked into similar types of levels, but starting in 2012. And then a number of other systems have emerged that have sort of, served to clarify LTS, potentially make it more accessible with fewer data inputs. that one of the biggest struggles with LTS is how to calculate it efficiently in lots of places. But at the same time, these systems have sort of muddied the waters in terms of what we might consider to be LTS, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. And we'll go into sort of how those waters have been muddied, so to speak, within this presentation. So this research study that we did had 2 main goals to it. The first was to examine the question of how different LTS methods, so comparing the 7 different methods that we showed on the previous slide, whether they yield comparable results. Are these essentially like comparing apples and oranges, or are all of these sort of different, maybe shades of the same apple or the same orange? And then secondly, how well do these LTS systems reflect how bicyclists actually feel? Are they a good representation of sort of on-the-ground experience as they're certainly intended to be? So getting into the first question, one thing that we did was we looked at these 7 different systems across a very large sample of streets in both Portland, Oregon, and Austin, Texas. And if these systems were all yielding exactly the same results, we would expect within these bar graphs, which show the classifications into LTS 1, 2, 3, and 4 across the different methods, we would expect the bar graphs to be the same across each of these rows. And as you can see, they're not exactly. There are some similarities, but we definitely find substantial differences, even within the same sample of streets. So what this means, of course, on the ground is that the same street, so here's an example from Portland, Oregon, that could actually be described in some sense by different systems with remarkably different LTS classes. And this is something that I think practitioners really have to keep in mind when they're using an LTS method and then describing a street as inherently low stress, when by a different method it could have yield an entirely different classification. This street actually could be expressed according to the different methods by any of the 4 LTS classes, which shows, it is sort of an extreme example, but shows a fairly cautionary perspective. So one interesting finding that we had was that there was actually more consistency in the way that LTS was classified within Austin. So there's some geographic difference. And we think that one of the main reasons behind this is that Austin streets may have less varied designs than in Portland. So if you have more consistency, in the way that streets are designed across the city, you end up with the nuances of street design having less implication on LTS outcomes, rather than the sort of big picture aspects of, what is the traffic volume, what are the number of lanes, etc. So the next phase of our research study was looking at the relationship between LTS and Ride Report. And Ride Report is a crowdsourcing app, or I should say it actually is no longer functioning in the way that it was when we did this study. Ride Report has turned its attention to scooters, as have many transportation companies and researchers. But at the time, Ride Report was an app that tracked where bicyclists rode, and then when they completed their trip, asked them to rate that. And when you take thousands of ratings and put them together onto a map, you can actually distill which segments of a street are generally considered more comfortable or less comfortable to riders. And Ride Report was most heavily deployed in Portland, Oregon, and Austin, Texas. So that's where we studied. So when we take Ride Report and we compare it on a segment by segment level with LTS scores, we actually find some fairly promising results. So, again, this is showing across each of the cities, which are in the rows, and then each of the LTS methods in the columns, which we studied. And you can see that in a general sense, there's a trend whereby lower LTS, so that's more comfortable streets according to LTS, are considered more comfortable by Ride Report scores. This is essentially what we would expect. This is good news for LTS. It's sort of a validator of the LTS concept. That said, again, we're finding some differences between the two cities. So we actually find a stronger relationship within Portland than we do in Austin. We think part of this might have to do, again, with differences in Portland, differences between low and high stress streets in Portland potentially being larger than they are in Austin. And again, we actually see that there's some differences across the LTS methods. Interestingly, the simpler LTS methods, at the extreme end of that is the conveyor method, which is a very simple method, has very few data inputs, actually has very strong correlations to what ride report is showing in terms of cyclist experience. And we think that part of that has to do with LTS, or ride report rather, being expressed or having a relationship with rather large differences in streets, as opposed to sort of very nuanced aspects that some of the more complex LTS methods capture. So in certain senses, the simpler ways of expressing what could be a lower high stress street are actually more effective. So another really important finding that we had from looking at the relationship between LTS and ride report, with ride report, we were able to break down our results by different types of cyclists. This has some limitations because the ride report data did not very precisely capture demographic variables, which is a big weakness with a lot of crowdsourced data. But we were able to distill, sort of infer characteristics of riders based on the way that they made trips. So for example, we could tell whether rides came from disadvantaged communities, whether riders generally made shorter trips, made trips at different times of day, or rode slower or faster. And we actually found that the correlations between ride report and LTS were strongest among some of these traditionally disadvantaged or underrepresented cyclists, which I think is actually a very encouraging finding for LTS, that it may be representing traditionally underrepresented cyclists as opposed to the sort of common, strong, and fearless cyclist that is often more represented in advocacy. So LTS is, I think, representing the types of cyclists that planners are really trying to engage. So I'll end with just some key takeaways, how we sort of frame these results in terms of policymaking and planning practice. And then we'll turn it over for questions. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about either other aspects of the research that you'd like to hear about, or we can dig into some of the details or other questions. So the first real key takeaway here is that not all the LTSs are sort of created equal. And to a certain extent, this is intentional. This is, LTS systems trying to be calculable with lower data requirements is a really big part of that, with different sort of criteria for different places. Some LTS systems are designed, specifically to represent a particular city or the data that's available in a certain place. But what that means is that we really can't just say, I'm doing LTS and have that mean the same thing everywhere. This is something that I've found a lot in my own work, both in research and practice, is people say, I'm doing an LTS analysis. Okay, well, we might be better off, we might really need to be a little more specific and saying, I'm doing an LTS analysis using the Mercuria method, for example, or using the conveyor method or the Firth method. And so I would really encourage practitioners to consider specifying that, just so that people know what they're talking about when they're reading the results. And I sort of boil this down to, when we're comparing LTS methods, we're probably not comparing apples to oranges, but we're definitely comparing different types of apples, and we should specify that. The second major finding is that LTS is fairly representative, we found, of perceptions. There's a general linear trend that's going on between ride report and LTS. And we think it's a pretty major finding that LTS may be particularly representative of of cyclists or types of cycling that is often underrepresented in planning. And then the third major finding I think we have for practice is we found, somewhat to our surprise, that really the simpler LTS methods were often were better correlated with like ride report perceptions, and were in some ways more consistent across cities and more robust to different data inputs. So something that I didn't get into in this study very much is that we looked at data inputs from a variety of locations and a variety of precisions, including data that we went out and collected ourselves, data that we got from OpenStreetMap, and data that we got from local agencies. And in a lot of cases, the simpler methods, so methods like the Conveil, Peter Furt's LTS 2.0, there was a method published by Lowry in a paper from a few years ago, that have very few inputs, actually are more robust to minimal data or imperfect data, and in some senses are more highly correlated with a measure like ride report. So it may be really worthwhile for practitioners to think about keeping it simple in terms of LTS. That's been a trend, I think, in development of LTS methods, and we would sort of advocate for that trend out of this research. So I'll stop there with the formal presentation and turn it over to questions. I see a few of them coming in already. Hillary, do you want to moderate those questions?
Yeah, I'll help. And as you see other questions that pop up, feel free to respond to them. But one of the questions that came up was someone was asking a little bit about the different variables that go into some of these methods. Right. And I think what I'm wondering is, could you give some examples of what those variables tend to be? And particularly if this idea of simpler being better, what are really the fundamental, smallest set of variables that you really think planners should be using for analyzing their network and ways to improve their network? And I think this is getting at that idea of how do you create linkages or find those places for linking islands of low stress areas.
Right. Yeah, so the first thing I want to sort of say as a caveat here is that we did not specifically measure the way that these different methods identify linkages, and that is actually a direction that we could extend this research to use that as a benchmark to say, are these different methods arriving at, for example, the same islands? And I think that would be a sort of valuable place to go. That said, in terms of one thing that we did study was which variables seem to have the biggest influence on things like ride report, and variables related to bicycle infrastructure. So bike lanes, separated bike lanes, bicycle boulevards, had a very large positive influence on perceptions. And that's really quite unsurprising. And then general measures, which are all sort of highly correlated of the bigness of a street. So things like traffic volume, number of lanes, speed limit, in many ways, these are all somewhat separate variables, but they're all extremely collinear. So more traffic lanes and traffic volume and higher speeds are always, are for the most part, going to be, consistent with one another. Those were a really strong negative driver. And that, that's very unsurprising. So some of the simpler methods, using Conveil as an example, essentially relied on measures of bigness of the street. So that would be functional measures like functional class, speed limit, number of lanes, coupled with bicycle infrastructure, and seemed to do a pretty good job of using those to have strong correlations with the ride report. Something that they don't get at, that the original some of the more original LTS methods definitely do, is nuanced interpretations of intersections. So there's a lot of there's a lot of a big part of the LTS method from, for example, Mercuria is about like right turn lanes and the sort of treatments at intersections, things like whether there's an island at a crosswalk that a bicyclist could use to make a two-stage crossing of an intersection, and none of that is represented in the simpler frameworks. So in part because the data is just really difficult to find.
Okay, so thank you. So as folks, if you have questions, please submit them through the chat window. You can either submit them directly to me or make them open to everyone. But there was another question that had come up during the registration process, and it struck me as an interesting question when you talked about the fact that the ride rating app had, and LTS had this strong ability to capture underrepresented cyclists. Yet the question was, well, what do we know about the traffic tolerance of folks who use these ride rating apps compared to the general population? I mean, are those folks your, hardcore cyclists, or are these folks the people that might be viewed as more underrepresented cyclists?
Right. So we went out of our way to identify a crowdsourced data source, which was Ride Report, that we felt actually did capture the sort of non-prototypical cyclist or the non-hardcore cyclist. That's been a big critique of sources like Strava, is sort of, I guess, the key source that has been critiqued, in part because it's so well used by recreational cyclists, and it's also fairly, you essentially get a self-selection on which trips are recorded, because people only, you have to, initiate the recording of a trip manually, and so folks might have a tendency to record trips that, where they're riding really hard and fast and are setting a personal record, or they're, it's sort of like trips that they're proud of on a recreational basis, as opposed to just the everyday, I'm commuting to work and I maybe had a bad experience trip. And so what was different about Ride Report, and I'm really quite disappointed that the specific Ride Report tool is no longer available to us, but I think other things will emerge that are like it, is that it first of all captured every trip. So it used an automated algorithm with the phone's GPS and accelerometer to identify this person is taking a bicycle trip, as opposed to any other type of transportation trip, and is always on in the background. And then it asked, with every bicycle trip for you to rate it. And so there was an opportunity to collect information about sort of trips other than sort of hardcore recreational trips. The second thing that really set it apart is that the Ride Report as a company started working with cities and organizations, sort of like large employers, for example, to use the app to collect data about things like bike to work month challenges. And so it was reaching an audience that was much more about sort of utility cycling, everyday cycling, and may have even been new to cycling, who were sort of taking it up as a way of participating in, a novel way of commuting to work. And sort of by that token, we're also, potentially themselves highly critical of the system, the activity. We're interested in sort of testing the waters. And so I think it reached a really different audience. And it's notable that when we did sort of, stratify our data based on, different speeds of cycling, different distances of cycling, et cetera, there was still a really substantial sample of fairly low-speed cyclists with moderate distances and who were riding in the middle of the day instead of during commuting hours. So that was very hopeful to us about the ability of crowdsourced data to capture those folks.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. Before I take over, are there any other questions that folks have for the research team that I can help convey? So, hi, Dan, you had a comment you were going to add.
Yeah, just I think to supplement Chester's response just very briefly, we fully agree with what he said, and despite I think our intent of trying to get to an app that was broadly used and maybe not too biased in what people reported, it's still not hundreds of thousands of people. For Portland, I think we worked with Right Report to get data from somewhere in 2016 as a cutoff point and after. So fairly recent data. And I think overall we had about 8,200 responses or so of individuals. So many more trips, but these are individuals. The glass is half full or half empty, depending on how you see it. 8,000 responses is great if you think about surveys. Fantastic. But again, who are they? That's a big question. At the same time, we had the Facebook issues coming up. And so Right Report did have some linkages to Facebook apps and so on that allowed them to see some individual level data, sex and age and a couple of other things, but the timing was not good, and they, I think, cautiously told us that they couldn't share that data with us, which I think made a lot of sense given what we now know about these apps.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, a very good example actually is this this link that I showed as an example. I actually went to go see, okay, what is the ride report score on this link? Would they say that it's essentially an LTS1 or LTS4? There weren't enough rides on this link for there to be a reliable ride report score. I think there were only 8 rides that were reported, and you basically need somewhere in the 30 to 40 range to get a statistically reliable score.
So any other questions for our research team? Well, I have one, and I think this really kind of reflects the spirit of MTI research. And we're really interested in understanding how do we recommend, or what advice do we provide for practitioners moving forward? And you had a great list of takeaways. But I was wondering if, if there was one big thing, if we are looking to increase cycling, particularly among underrepresented cyclists, to provide more alternatives to using a private automobile, what do you think your research provides for practitioners?
I think that it provides some empirical backing to the concept of LTS as being expressive of what people are feeling on the ground. There's sort of an intuitiveness to the LTS system, suggesting that roads that have lower speeds and fewer lanes and have bicycle lanes should be more comfortable for cyclists, and they should see a difference in terms of whether folks find those comfortable places to bicycle. I think that probably one of the biggest things that our study provides is that sort of comparison that is difficult sometimes to untangle in a really sort of data-driven way, that shows that relationship. It's not a perfect relationship. It's still, at the end of the day, LTS is an inherent simplification. It's taking a lot of variables and trying to make something that's sort of clean and intelligible, and has only 4 levels as a way of describing them. But the fact that, there is more often than not a very clear difference in cyclists' minds between something that's LTS1 and LTS4 is, I think, an important takeaway for just sort of the external validity of the LTS system.
Great, thank you. So can I have you switch to the last slide there, Chester, because I just want to remind people of how they can get in touch with you all. So you can take a look at the full report. I know that our research team is always willing to answer specific questions, so please reach out to them with additional questions you may have. And our next Research Snap webinar will take place on January 30th. And it is a study that looks at basically distractions and this idea of distracted driving. And we have the title, Hands-Free Texting, Is It Really Safer? So thank you all. There will be a recording for the webinar available on our website. And I appreciate you taking 30 minutes out of your busy days to learn a little bit more about our research program.